His last radio transmission was not a goodbye. On April 24, 1967, Vladimir Komarov fell from the sky inside a spacecraft that had been broken before it ever left the ground. Soviet engineers had logged over 203 technical faults with the Soyuz one before launch. He knew about most of them. He flew anyway. What makes a man climb into a spacecraft he knows is going to kill him? Not recklessness, not ignorance. Something else entirely. Something that gets to the core of what this program has always been. And what does that choice, that one man's decision on a launchpad in Kazakhstan in 1967, have to do with 4 astronauts orbiting the moon right now? We are going to count the graves, every single one of them. 31 people died so that Artemis II could leave the launch pad. Some of their names are carved in granite monuments at Cape Canaveral. Others were classified for decades by governments that refused to admit what had happened. A few were never officially recorded at all. Their names are the blueprint of every spacecraft flying today. This is the cost of Artemis II, and it is not what you think. Vladimir Komarov was not a reckless man. He was methodical, precise, the kind of pilot that flight surgeons trusted because he never dramatized anything. He had flown in space before, on Voskhod 1 in 1964, the first multi-person spacecraft. He understood the machines. He understood their limits. In late 1966, he was assigned to command Soyuz 1, the first crewed flight of the Soviet Union's new spacecraft program. The mission was politically engineered to be spectacular. Soyuz 1 would launch first, followed the next day by Soyuz 2, carrying 3 more cosmonauts, and the 2 vehicles would rendezvous in orbit. A space spectacular, timed to coincide with a national celebration. The problem was that Soyuz 1 was not ready. A quality control inspector named Alexei Pravetsky documented 203 technical faults with the spacecraft before launch. 203. His report was presented to program leadership. Nothing was canceled. Nothing was even delayed. The political calendar did not accommodate mechanical reality. Komarov's friend and colleague, Yuri Gagarin, the first human in space, the most famous person in the Soviet Union, knew. He had read the reports, he had seen the faults, and he tried to stop it in the only way available to him. Gagarin volunteered to replace Komarov as commander. His reasoning was cold and logical. Soviet leadership would never risk losing the first man in space. They would cancel the mission entirely. It was a calculated sacrifice of his own flight status to save his friend's life. The scheme failed. Leadership did not cancel the mission. They called Gagarin's bluff. Komarov was left standing at the launch pad with a choice that had no good answers: refuse to fly. In which case, Gagarin, as his backup, would be ordered to take the seat, or fly and carry that weight into orbit. When colleagues later asked Komarov why he hadn't simply refused, his answer was devastating in its simplicity. If he refused, Gagarin would go in his place. He would not let his friend die for him. He flew. On April 23, 1967, Soyuz 1 reached orbit. Within minutes, one of the 2 solar panels failed to deploy. Without full power, the spacecraft was crippled from the first minutes. The attitude control system began malfunctioning. The vehicle started to tumble. Komarov fought the vehicle for over 24 hours. He manually fired thrusters to stabilize a capsule that was never designed to be flown by hand for that long. He tried the backup attitude control systems. He tried everything. Mission control in Moscow watched the telemetry, and understood that the rendezvous with Soyuz 2 was impossible. Soyuz 2 was never launched. After more than a day in orbit, Komarov managed to align the spacecraft for re-entry. Barely. The descent module separated from the orbital module. Atmospheric braking worked. The capsule was falling toward Kazakhstan at the right angle. For a few minutes, it looked like he might survive. Then the main parachute failed to deploy properly. The lines twisted in the container. The backup parachute deployed, entangled with the partially opened main. Soyuz 1 hit the ground at approximately 40 meters per second. The retro-rocket fuel ignited on impact. When the recovery team arrived, they found a burning crater and a mass of charred metal. Komarov's remains were identifiable only by fragments of bone. He was 40 years old. He had known. He had chosen. 11 months later, Gagarin died in a jet crash during a routine training flight. He was 34. The investigation into Soyuz 1 found that the parachute container walls had been improperly manufactured, coated with a polymerizing substance that caused the chute lines to snag on deployment. Engineers had flagged the problem before launch. It had not been fixed. Political pressure had pushed a broken spacecraft into the sky and killed the man who climbed into it to save his friend. The Soviet government classified everything for years. No public investigation, no public memorial. Komarov's funeral drew enormous crowds, but the specific cause of his death was not discussed. Not officially, not then. Soyuz was redesigned. The parachute system was rebuilt. Subsequent Soyuz missions flew with improved quality controls. Komarov became, in death, the engineer he had been overruled in life. Every fix made to that spacecraft after April 24, 1967, was made because of what happened to him. 3 months before Komarov died, 3 American astronauts burned alive on a launch pad in Florida. January 27, 1967. Launch Complex 34, Cape Kennedy. Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were sealed inside the Apollo 1 command module, running a routine countdown simulation. They were not going to space that day. They were practicing. The capsule was pressurized with pure oxygen at slightly above atmospheric pressure. In that environment, materials that would barely smolder in normal air become catastrophically flammable. Velcro strips, nylon netting, foam padding. The interior of the capsule was lined with material that in a pure oxygen atmosphere would react to a spark the way gasoline reacts to a flame. At 6:31 in the evening, a spark from a frayed wire beneath Grissom's seat found the oxygen. Pure oxygen does not burn the way air does. It detonates. Chaffee's voice came over the radio. Fire. Then, we've got a bad fire. Then, we're burning up. Then, silence. Ed White tried to open the hatch. It was designed with 6 bolts that required a ratchet to open from the inside, one at a time. Under normal conditions, this took approximately 90 seconds. Under these conditions, with internal pressure rising, the cabin filling with smoke and flame, impossible. The 3 men were dead within minutes. Asphyxiation from toxic gases. Their suits had melted and fused to the cabin interior. It took 6 hours before the bodies could be removed. The investigation that followed identified 1,400 safety problems with the Apollo spacecraft. 1,400. North American Aviation, the contractor that built the capsule, had known about many of them. NASA had known about some. Grissom himself had been so frustrated with the spacecraft's quality that his crew posed for a photograph with their heads bowed in prayer, hands clasped, and sent it to the program manager with an inscription that read, "It isn't that we don't trust you, Joe, But this time, we've decided to go over your head. He was joking. Then he was dead. NASA halted crewed Apollo flights for 20 months. They redesigned the hatch so it could be opened in seconds. From the inside, no tools required. They replaced the cabin atmosphere with a nitrogen-oxygen mix during ground tests. They stripped out every flammable material they could identify. They rebuilt the spacecraft from the inside out. 2 years later, Apollo 11 landed on the Moon. The quick-release hatch on the Orion spacecraft, the hatch that allows the Artemis II crew to evacuate in an emergency in under 10 seconds, is a direct design descendant of what killed Grissom, White, and Chaffee. Every feature of that hatch exists because 3 men could not get out of a burning capsule in time. Launch Complex 34 was decommissioned in 1969. It stands today at Cape Canaveral, abandoned, overgrown with wild pepper trees and tall grass, slowly rusting in the Florida salt air. A faded sign reads, "Abandon in place." 3 granite benches sit at the base, 1 for each man. Every January, their families return to lay flowers. Here is what makes the next death so difficult to absorb. The spacecraft worked perfectly. June 30th, 1971. Cosmonauts Georgy Dobrovolsky, Vladislav Volkov, and Viktor Patsayev were returning to Earth after 22 days aboard Salyut 1, the world's first space station. They had broken every human endurance record that existed. The mission had been a triumph. As the descent module separated from the orbital section, a pressure equalization valve opened prematurely. At 168 kilometers altitude, still firmly in the vacuum of space, the cabin atmosphere began venting. They were not wearing pressure suits. This was not an oversight. The Soyuz had been designed to carry 3 cosmonauts, but only if they wore no suits. The cabin was too small to accommodate 3 suited men. This was a known design compromise, a deliberate weight-saving calculation made by engineers years earlier. The valve that failed was located beneath the cosmonauts' seats, hidden from their direct view. There is evidence they tried to find it and close it manually. Under ideal conditions, that process would have taken several minutes. They had less than one. Within 30 seconds of the valve opening, cabin pressure dropped to near vacuum. They lost consciousness. Within 2 minutes, all 3 were dead. The capsule continued its descent in fully automatic mode. The guidance system functioned correctly. The parachute deployed on schedule. The retro rockets fired at the correct altitude. Soyuz 11 touched down softly in the Kazakhstan steppe, exactly as programmed, with perfect precision. When the recovery team opened the hatch, expecting to greet 3 triumphant cosmonauts, fresh from a record-breaking mission, they found 3 dead men, still strapped in their seats, blue-faced, silent. This is the pattern, not one catastrophic failure, isolated, learned from, fixed. The same catastrophic failure in different forms across decades. Apollo 1 was a design compromise that became a death trap. Soyuz 1 was a political deadline that became a coffin. Soyuz 11 was a weight-saving gamble that became a vacuum. 3 deaths, 2 countries, 1 recurring logic, the decision to accept a known risk because fixing it was inconvenient. The Soviet space program halted for 2 years. When flights resumed, cosmonauts wore pressure suits during launch and re-entry. No exceptions. The Soyuz was redesigned to carry 2 cosmonauts instead of 3, creating enough room for both to wear full suits. That requirement persists to this day in every crewed spacecraft on Earth, including Orion. The orange suits the Artemis II crew wore during their launch. The Orion crew survival system suits, the suits they will wear again when they re-enter Earth's atmosphere. Those suits exist because of Dobrovolsky, Volkov, and Petsayev. Because 3 men suffocated in the silence of space, while a valve the size of a coin bled their atmosphere into nothing, and a spacecraft they were no longer alive to see landed perfectly without them. January 28, 1986, Space Shuttle Challenger. 73 seconds after liftoff. 7 people. The cause was an O-ring seal in the right solid rocket booster. The morning was unusually cold at Cape Canaveral. Temperatures had dropped below freezing overnight. The rubber seals had stiffened in the low temperatures, losing the elasticity they needed to maintain a tight seal between booster segments. Hot combustion gas leaked through the failed seal, burned through the external fuel tank, and the vehicle disintegrated. Engineers at Morton Thiokol, the contractor that manufactured the solid rocket boosters, had warned NASA the night before the launch. They had data. They had graphs showing O-ring performance at different temperatures. They recommended delaying the launch. NASA managers pushed back. The engineers were overruled. Francis Scobie, Michael Smith, Judith Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, Ronald McNair, Gregory Jarvis, Krista McAuliffe, a high school teacher from New Hampshire, selected from over 11,000 applicants to be the first civilian in space. Millions of children were watching the launch live in their classrooms when the vehicle broke apart. 7 names, 7 people. The investigation found something more disturbing than a single mechanical failure. The Rogers Commission identified a pattern they called the normalization of deviance. O-ring erosion had been observed on previous shuttle flights. Rather than treat that erosion as a warning of impending catastrophe, NASA had gradually redefined it as acceptable risk, because those previous flights had landed safely despite the damage. Each successful landing with damaged O-rings made the damage seem more normal, until the morning it killed 7 people. NASA rebuilt. They redesigned the solid rocket boosters. They implemented crew escape systems. They required pressure suits during ascent and re-entry. 17 years later, almost to the day, the same pattern came back. February 1st, 2003, Space Shuttle Columbia. During launch 16 days earlier, a piece of insulating foam had detached from the external tank and struck the reinforced carbon panels on the leading edge of the left wing. Engineers on the ground noticed the foam strike. Some raised concerns and requested satellite imagery to assess the damage. The request was turned down by management. The conclusion was that the debris was unlikely to cause serious damage, partly because foam strikes had occurred on previous missions without causing catastrophic failure. The same normalization, the same logic, the same institutional refusal to treat a recurring anomaly as the emergency it was. For 16 days, the crew conducted over 80 experiments in microgravity. They had no idea the wing was compromised. They went to sleep. They woke up. They did science. They talked to their families. On the 16th day, Columbia re-entered the atmosphere. Superheated gas entered through the hole in the wing. The internal structure began to melt. The wing collapsed. The orbiter broke apart over Texas and Louisiana at 60 kilometers altitude. Rick Husband, William McCool, Michael Anderson, David Brown, Kalpana Chawla, Laurel Clark, Ilan Ramon, 7 more names. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board reached a conclusion that should have been impossible 17 years after Challenger. NASA had not learned the lessons. The organizational culture that allowed known risks to be redefined as acceptable had survived intact. The board wrote that the causes of the two disasters were, at their root, identical. 21 astronauts and cosmonauts. That is the count of people who died during or directly because of crewed space missions, across both programs over 4 decades. 21 human beings. But that number is not 31. Not yet. There are names that almost never appear in the coverage. Valentin Bondarenko was a Soviet cosmonaut trainee. He died in March 1961, weeks before Gagarin's historic flight, when fire broke out in a pressurized oxygen chamber during an endurance test. He was 24 years old. The Soviet government classified his death for decades. His name does not appear in most Western histories of the space race. He was the first person to die in a space program-related accident. He died before a single human being had ever reached orbit, and almost no one knows his name. Theodore Freeman, killed in October 1964 when a goose struck his T-38 jet trainer during a routine flight, shattering the canopy and flaming out both engines. He had been selected as a NASA astronaut. He had never been to space. Charles Bassett and Elliot C., the original crew assigned to Gemini 9, killed in a jet crash in February 1966 while approaching the McDonnell plant in St. Louis in bad weather. Clifton Williams, killed in a T-38 crash in 1967. Robert Lawrence, the first African-American astronaut selected by any space program, killed in an F-104 crash the same year. Michael Adams, who died when his X-15 entered an uncontrollable spin and disintegrated at 65,000 feet. Michael Alsbury, co-pilot of Spaceship Two, killed in 2014 when the vehicle's feathering mechanism deployed prematurely during a powered test flight. These are the names that don't have memorial ceremonies broadcast on national television. Every ejection seat protocol, every flight envelope restriction, every crew escape system that has been refined over the decades carries the fingerprints of someone who ran out of altitude, speed, or time. And then there are the people whose names most of the world will never know at all. October 24th, 1960. Baikonur Cosmodrome, Kazakhstan. An R-16 intercontinental ballistic missile exploded on the launch pad during pre-launch testing. The blast and fire killed approximately 120 people. Military personnel, civilian engineers, rocket technicians. Among the dead, Marshal Mitrofan Nedelin, commander of Soviet rocket forces, who had positioned himself 20 meters from the rocket to pressure his teams to work faster. The Soviet government classified the entire disaster for decades. Another explosion at Plesetsk Cosmodrome in 1980 killed 48 more people, technicians, workers, people who had never been selected for anything, people who were simply doing their jobs. These were not astronauts. They were the welders, the propellant handlers, the quality control inspectors, the people who built the machines and fueled them and tightened the bolts at 3 a.m. before a launch. Their names are not on any monument that most people would recognize. But every piece of ground safety infrastructure at Kennedy Space Center, every fueling procedure, every blast radius calculation, all of it descends from lessons learned in fires and explosions that killed workers whose only ambition was to do their job and go home. 31. That is the minimum count of named individuals, astronauts, cosmonauts, trainees, and test pilots, who died so that human beings could learn to leave this planet without being destroyed by it. If you include the ground crews of Baikonur and Cape Canaveral, The unnamed technicians, the workers vaporized in explosions, the people poisoned by propellant leaks. The number reaches well past 150. Right now, somewhere between the Earth and the Moon, 4 people are alive inside a spacecraft designed around everything those 31 and more taught us. The launch abort system above their capsule, the one that would yank them clear of the rocket in a fraction of a second if something went catastrophically wrong during ascent, works because of Apollo 1, because 3 men could not open a hatch. The pressure suits they wore at launch exist because of Soyuz 11, because 3 cosmonauts who broke every endurance record in history suffocated on the way home while their spacecraft landed perfectly without them. The solid rocket booster joints beneath them were redesigned because of Challenger, because engineers were overruled on a cold January morning, and 73 seconds later, there was nothing left. The heat shield beneath their feet was stress-tested with extra caution, and the launch was delayed, and delayed again, and delayed a 3rd time because of Columbia. Because foam nobody took seriously punched a hole in a wing. Nobody checked. The culture that delayed their launch to fix problems rather than fly with known risks was purchased at the cost of 21 lives. Their names are the blueprint: Grissom and White and Chaffee, Komarov, Dobrovolsky, Volkov, and Patsayev, the 7 of Challenger, the 7 of Columbia, Bondarenko, the unnamed workers of Baikonur, the test pilots who ran out of sky. The crew named their Orion spacecraft Integrity. They chose the name, they said, to honor the trust between the people making the mission possible. More than 300,000 individual components integrated into a single vehicle by teams working across the globe. But integrity also means wholeness, completeness. The spacecraft is whole because every crack, every failure, every catastrophe in the history of human spaceflight has been stitched into its design. It carries the scar tissue of 60 years of trial and death and trial again. Those are the people who built Artemis II, not with their hands, with their deaths. And the only way to honor them is to remember that every safety protocol, every redundant system, every delayed launch, every conservative engineering decision, every single one of them is a monument to someone who did not come home. The next crew will not just fly around the moon, they will land on it, and when they do, they will stand on a surface where a small aluminum figurine has rested since 1971, placed there by the crew of Apollo 15 in memory of the astronauts and cosmonauts who died before them. It is still there, waiting,